What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I got a video for you guys. This is 10 precise moments that forever changed MMA rules. Now, as you guys know, rules are a thing. Usually rules are things that you learn through experience. I mean, you have the basic stuff that I'm sure everybody would, with common sense, would know not to break, but most of the other rules tend to be things that come through with some type of issue or mistake or through some type of experience. I mean, you never know, there's certain moves might be banned and things like that, not because of what we just automatically know about it, but maybe because that move was used at one time and they saw just the effects that it has. So it was like, okay, we're probably gonna have to stop doing that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and check this out. This video, if I'm assuming right, it should actually show footage of the exact things that cause certain rules to go into effect. And I'm hoping that they have videos like this related to other sports as well, because I think that this would be an interesting series of videos. And just for a note, this video was made by MMA On Point, and we'll have a link for their channel at the end of this video. The last 30 seconds, you can click on it, go to their channel, like, subscribe, comment, all the other good stuff. And I do have a original link in the description box down below, so go and click on that if you want to check out the original video. I highly encourage you to check out the original before you watch the reaction. That is super important, because that way it allows the original content creator to get a view and make ad revenue on the videos that they create, so they can make more videos. Want to see more videos? Watch the original video. Let's go and check this out.
One of the biggest misconceptions about MMA is that it has very few rules. Depending on how your hands are placed on the ground, you can't use certain maneuvers, you can't elbow at particular angles. Apparently, if you have a boob job, that creates a bit of an issue with getting past health regulations. I don't know. And the more and more you dive into it, the more mindless minutia there is in the rule set. And so this misconception that there are so few rules stems back to the old days more than it does anything else. Ball punches, fish hooking, hair pulling, punches to the back of the head, knees on the ground, etc. used to all be legal, which for obvious reasons all became illegal. But there are also a lot of crazy rules that basically had to come about because somebody actually tried to do it. So that's what we'll get into today. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are the top 10 houses sold by Ally Quinta.
Wait, what? I will let this continue in a minute, but I just wanted to say something real quick. It's actually funny when you think about, because I remember when MMA and the UFC first, well, not the MMA, but when UFC first started, and people considered it like a savage sport, and boxing was considered the sport of champions and things like that. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure even if you just base it on the time that MMA started, you don't even have to take the entire history of boxing, but let's say the exact same time MMA started, and that year from boxing to now. During that time span, haven't there been more people to die in boxing than there have in MMA? I could be wrong about that, but I consider it kind of funny considering MMA is seen as the savage sport, and in the long run it's kind of safer. I think that's because they have less fights. They don't fight as long. Things like that. But let's check this out.
Finally.
Number 10, the Mac Mansion. I don't know what just happened there. My bad. These are 10 precise fight moments that forever changed MMA rules. Number 10, Vaseline Gate. Prior to almost all fights in any combat sport, you can usually see a cut man applying Vaseline to a fighter's face, which also gets topped up in between rounds. And basically the reason why is Vaseline reduces the chance of skin getting cut and minimizes the friction of incoming shots. Because obviously it's not ideal to have a fight stopped just because of a cut. But until UFC 94, a fighter's cornerman was allowed to apply this at the end of each round. And if you've ever felt Vaseline or petroleum jelly more generically, you'll know it's extremely slippery. So when George St. Pierre's corner began illegally rubbing the substance on his shoulders, chest, and back during his welterweight title defense at UFC 94, questions reasonably arose. Now, nobody knows if this was an honest mistake or genuine attempt to cheat since it was such an incredibly small amount, but his opponent that night, BJ Penn, was furious, and even Dana White had a brief octagon side rant. As a result of the hubbub, right then and there, GSP was toweled down at the beginning of the rounds 3 and 4 by members of the commission. So the Vaseline issue was only in play during the second rounds, but this was an extremely glaring flaw ripe for abuse, and with the extremely vocal protest of BJ Penn's camp and Dana's feelings about the entire thing, the UFC instituted a permanent rule along with the athletic commissions that employed independent cutmen to exclusively apply Vaseline moving forward to the fighters. Number 9. No more Speedos. There's not many sports that have a bigger disparity in male to female fans than MMA. Our own channel's metrics reflect that pretty starkly.
We're the fucking females.
That's basically why we have ring girls and not Magic Mike types parading around the cage, unless of course you're an Invicta. But at UFC 133, Dennis Holman didn't only fight inside the octagon, but he also ended up showing more skin than your favorite ring girl. In his TKO loss to Brian Ebersol, who already made things weird by having an arrow shaved right into his chest, Holman wore an extremely small pair of blue trunks, claiming to have lost a bet with his teammates.
And that kind of thing, but a bet's a bet, and you gotta, you gotta stand up for what you bet.
Regardless, Dana White was outraged in the aftermath, saying that he was horrified at what he saw.
I would call it disgusting. That was disgusting.
Is it that bad?
And no one would ever fight in the UFC again looking like that.
It will never happen again, I can guarantee you that.
Thank you, Dana. For his next fight, Holman would go on to pick up a submission win, but his contract was never renewed by the UFC. And although Dana claims this wasn't due to the clothing fiasco, not that many people are released on winning streaks. And to this day, if you type in Dennis Holman on Google, Speedo and shorts are usually the first suggestions that show up with your results. The legend lives on. Number 8, 12-6 elbows. This is perhaps the silliest rule that fans want changed the most, especially if your name is John Jones. The most common reason why this straight up and straight down elbow is banned is because athletic commissions were afraid based on seeing martial arts demonstrations where they would break like a whole foot of ice or something dumb like that. Boards that were weakened ahead of time, you know, that kind of thing. While true that this is a factor, that's actually only part of the reason. While speaking on the Joe Rogan podcast, Big John McCarthy, who was there when the first official unified rules of mixed martial arts were created, explained that this technique was banned also due to one single fight. In the year 2000, 6'10" Gan McGee faced a much smaller foe in Brad Gabriel at IFC.
Wait a minute. I think I know what this is. Is this the one where he had him in like the crucifix hold and like he was like just like on the side of his head?
Battleground 2. Unfortunately, we couldn't find footage of this online. It's probably in somebody's VHS player or maybe dubbed over. The Giant McGee, who would later go on to challenge for the UFC heavyweight title, blasted his opponent with these downward elbows repeatedly, and it was one of the doctors at this event who would assist John McCarthy in creating the unified rules. The doctor wanted to ban all elbows at first, but settled on just banning the 12-6 downwards elbow because of John McCarthy. He cited this fight as the major reason why. Number 7. Throwing
12-6 elbows. So I'm guessing that means elbows from like straight down or straight up. If I'm wrong about that, let me know.
An opponent over the cage. Despite the fact that there weren't many rules in Tank Abbott's day, you already know he's the type of guy who wouldn't follow the rules even in modern MMA, if he felt he could get away with it. And his intentions during his fight with Cal Worsham at Ultimate in 1996 led to an instant rule being created that many fans may not have even thought about. Immediately as the fight started, Abbott, who had a walkout stat that he benched over 600 pounds, rushed forward in his typical brawling manner, but then surprisingly picked up the 230-pound Cal Worsham and literally tried throwing his opponent over the octagon like it's dead or alive and ring outs an automatic win or something. The worrying thing was Tank Abbott actually came pretty close, with Worsham explaining that only his heel and the padding saved him from the embarrassment. In the end, Tank comfortably got the victory, but obviously the potential for a fighter to fall 6 foot head first onto a metal platform needed to be removed. Big John McCarthy soon after made the ruling within the UFC to disqualify anyone who tried to throw their opponent over the side of the cage. which also led to the realization that fence grabbing should probably also be banned. Number 6, short
What
grabbing.
is that video?
In MMA today, there's minimal excess
Is that
clothing,
clip
and
from
for
a
good
movie?
reason. Fighter shorts don't get in the way by constantly getting disheveled or untucked like they did with the old gis, and still do in full gi BJJ competitions today. But in the case of Pat Miletich versus Mikey Burnett for the inaugural welterweight title back in 1998, both men's shorts somehow became a pivotal aspect of the fight. Throughout the entire contest, both Miletich and Burnett had a solid grasp of each other's shorts, which resulted in one very dull affair as neither fighter could break away and begin striking very often. Not only did it make for an obviously uneventful inaugural title fight to take place, but also the crowd found the whole ordeal pretty comical. John McCarthy had the unenviable task of having to fix Burnett's shorts and getting dangerously close to his junk in the process, while fans had a great view of Miletich's right butt cheek. What the fuck, man? So, short grabbing became instantly banned and fighters were legally unable to use them for leverage, again for obvious reasons. Pat's shorts were coincidentally the first UFC shorts with the infamous tap out logo on them and were sold on eBay for over $1,500 in 2015. I'm sure they smell really great. Number 5, the introduction of TKOs. In the very first iteration of the UFC, fights were only ended in one of 3 ways: knockout, submission, or by cornermen throwing in the towel. But even these minimal rules weren't abided by at the inaugural UFC event.
Anybody else missed the Stretch Armstrong logo on UFC? The one with the giant ass Mr. Fantastic hands. Good old days.
But even these minimal rules weren't abided by at the inaugural UFC event when Gerard Gordeau landed a massive head kick to the sumo fighter Taylor Tuli and sent his tooth soaring into the front row. That's because the original referee understandably recognized the danger and stopped the fight. UFC founder Royce Gracie was extremely upset because he didn't want stoppages back then at all. Basically, the loser is out completely cold, or they somehow quit through themselves or their team. So Horion asked his friend Big John McCarthy to referee from there on out and follow this rule completely blindly, unlike the first referees did. Enter UFC 2, where Pat Smith delivered some hellacious elbows to Scott Morris from the mount. So due to the rules, McCarthy was totally unable to stop the fight. And it appears that Big John shouting at Morris's corner and Pat Smith hearing that, deciding to get up, or him just deciding that it was done, meant that the brutal onslaught was over. You can only imagine if he just didn't stop. And so after the event, in this particular moment, McCarthy threatened to Horion that he would quit if not given the power to protect fighters. So starting at UFC 3, the concept of referee stoppages were born. Number 4, groin shots. Inspired by the...
That saved a lot of people's life, because if there's one thing UFC is like notorious for, it's for fighters continuing to punch someone when they're clearly knocked out. So I can only imagine, like, if the ref wasn't allowed to stop the person and the person could just sit there and just keep on punching or kicking or whatever else, yeah, that would have added to some body counts on UFC's hands. That not only did that doctor save a lot of lives, it saved UFC a lot of money from settlements and lawsuits.
The concept of referee stoppages were born. Number 4, groin shots. Inspired by the UFC, the International Vale-Tudo Championship, or IVC for short, held their first event in 1997. It was a one-night tournament in which former UFC fighter Gary Big Daddy Goodridge fought lucha libre expert Pedro Octavio in the finals. Eye gouging and biting were illegal, but groin shots were given the green light by the Brazilian organization, to which Goodridge obliged, striking right at his opponent's prized possession, but would even go further than just kneeing Octavio's balls, digging his feet and toes literally into Pedro's trunks to try to escape being on the bottom. When the two were standing, Goodridge got even more uncomfortably intimate with his opponent, getting a handful of his junk that forced Pedro to fall to the ground in discomfort. And yeah, all this led to Goodridge securing the stoppage victory. The IVC thankfully would create a specific rule banning a fighter from reaching into their opponent's trunks for the following event. The most infamous and justified ball smashing occurred at UFC 4 between convicted gang rapist and murderer Joe Sun by Keith Hackney. But this alone...
Wait, what? What was that? Hold up, go back. Austin Powers actor arraigned in cellmate murder. Joseph Sun serving life sentence for 1990 gang rape. Austin Powers is in like 1997, 1999, somewhere around there. Did they discover this after that?
4, between convicted gang rapist and murderer Joe Son by Keith Hackney. But this alone wasn't enough to force an immediate rule change, as this took place a whole 3 years later before the promotion would ban it in 1997, which coincidentally was a few months after the IVC banned it, but for totally different reasons, with mounting political pressure being the biggest reason of all. Number 3. Lay and pray. After their first fight at UFC 1, both Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock won various tournaments and titles before their rematch. The UFC's first poster boy Gracie won the UFC 2 and 4 tournaments, while Shamrock went and conquered Pancrase.
Royce Gracie is probably I would have to say, you probably have to throw him up there with Bruce Lee and, like, as far as like some of the most prominent people in martial arts, like people that changed the way martial arts were forever, Royce Gracie is right up there. Like, I can only, like, he destroyed the idea of martial arts styles in a way. Like in the 80s, there was like everybody had a particular style that they went for. Like Bruce Lee popularized martial arts in the Western world to like a whole new level. Back before Bruce Lee, it was like karate and judo, and like that was it. Bruce Lee opened up the entire martial arts world to the Western world, pretty much. Royce Gracie, he solidified what the best martial arts were in a tournament with all the best in every single, well, not every single, but all the best in a big portion of martial arts styles. His came out on top, and not just did it come out on top, but it came out on top with flying colors. So he pretty much put Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on the map, and like I'm imagining people probably put him on that level, but I just want to make sure everybody does it. The man deserves a ton of respect for what he's done for martial arts. It's crazy.
Picking up the inaugural title in Japan. So obviously there was a significant amount of hype when the two rematched at UFC 5, with fans hoping to see how Ken could tackle Royce's submission game at the second attempt. But instead of the interesting grappling affair everyone had hoped for, we witnessed a whole load of inactivity, with Shamrock laying tight in Gracie's guard, just avoiding submissions mostly, and barely taking the risk to land much ground and pound of his own. With there being no ruling to stand up the fighters for lack of action back then, Shamrock essentially just laid there defensively and was afraid to risk anything on top of Royce Gracie for 36 whole minutes until the fight was declared a draw, which marked the longest bout in UFC history and the first draw in the promotion ever. In order to combat this, the referees were immediately given the ability to stand up fighters for inactivity for the following event, which definitely was a great addition to the rule set. Unfortunately, this means we've seen many questionable stand-ups since then, but at least it does prevent something like this from happening.
That seems like it should have been obvious. Like, boxing has refs to separate people from clinches and stuff like that. This is pretty much just a clinch. I would imagine that should have been something that should have been thought. They should have looked at other sports and just like took stuff from there, I think.
Many questionable stand-ups since then, but at least it does prevent something like this from happening. On top of this, overtime limits were formally adopted, in part to avoid, number 2, the introduction of judges. The old UFC brass definitely hated the idea of having to bring in judges. They hoped that they had addressed the issue of inactivity with ref stand-ups and overtimes, therefore preventing subsequent draws. After all, aside from Ken vs. Royce 2, 68 of the first 69 UFC fights all ended with a finish. Problem solved, right? Well, not entirely, as Ken Shamrock met Oleg Taktarov at UFC 7 with Ken's super fight title on the line, but standing both men up and asking for action didn't lead to a finish. Despite Shamrock being the aggressor, the bout lacked much activity at all, and a stoppage was never close throughout the 33 minutes. Ken claimed in his autobiography that he didn't want to inflict too much damage on Oleg, who would train with the Lion's Den, but he was also known for training people ruthlessly back then with a coaching style of just beating everyone up. So sure. He also said having shoes at UFC 1 would have meant he would beat Royce Gracie.
They took away my shoes because they knew that if they could take away my balance, that Royce would have a better chance of beating me. Just my opinion, they cheated.
But nevertheless, without any actual judges in place octagon side to score the fight, yet another big main event in the UFC ended in a draw and therefore a massive failure. In response, the next event was the first in UFC history to feature judges' scorecards and decisions along with a 15-minute time limit in an effort to push the action further. Ironically though, during the tournament, both semifinals and the final would all go to a decision. Number 1. One Championship's weight cutting. I think most of us can easily agree that weight cutting is probably the most ridiculous aspect of this sport. Nearly all fighters undergo a gruesome dehydration process just in order to not be the smaller man with a weight disadvantage a day later at fight night. In December of 2015, 21-year-old Chinese flyweight Yang Jianbing tragically paid the ultimate price for this insanity and died after attempting a particularly difficult weight cut. It's extremely disappointing that it took a death in order for the ruling to change, but One Championship made a drastic overhaul to their weight cutting protocols as a direct result, and utilized hydration tests to essentially eradicate weight cuts altogether. But there are tons of questions of this still, as many fighters look noticeably big on fight night. There are examples like Eddie Alvarez, where even though lightweight is at 170 pounds in one instead of 155, his walking around weight has been claimed to be as high as 190 in the past. You shouldn't be able to get past hydration test if you're that heavy. He's also stated that his opponents are bigger than him in one. DJ has said the same about his opponents. For Angela Lee, it's in the reverse at atom weight, where she looks bigger than her opponents. In the last month or so, they finally started posting video of the weigh-ins, even though folks like Angela Lee are still showing up needing to use a hoop, which is indicative of a weight cut. Of course, it's still possible if she's trying to stay within hydration limits and just needs that last little bit in the article of clothing to shave it off. It just requires a bit of healthy skepticism, because if it works properly, it should definitely be brought to MMA around the world if it can do what it claims. But the death associated with this rule automatically makes it top our list, and certainly is the most important change to make before it happens under the unified rules. I'd like to thank Tom MJ Moore for editing this video. You can follow him on Twitter at Tom MJ Moore. And then I'd also like to thank Charlie Howard, who helped me write this list. You can follow him on Twitter at MMA_Charlie. Thanks for watching my list, guys. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and like. We upload at least 3 videos per week about MMA, and it really helps us out when you do so. If I missed anything on this vid, let me know in the comments, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at Jason the Heart, or follow the official channel account at OnPointMMA. Thanks for watching so much, and I'll catch you on the next video.
I'm gonna go through to see what else is on there. All right, looks like this is maybe an announcement. Interesting. I know a couple of these YouTubers. A new chapter begins. MMA on Point presents Scream. A brand new channel with brand new content. It took 20 years to be something. Change Rambo with the same passion. Movie you'll never see, you've never heard of. Alright, I don't know what I'm saying at this point. With that being said, that's been this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. Hopefully you've been enlightened to something. I've never really sat back and thought about like what creates certain rules. I mean, obviously some of the more abstract sounding rules obviously had to have happened because of some type of thing happening, but yeah, I mean, I would love to see a video like this with other sports. Like I said, with basketball in particular. Like I know, for example, the goaltending rule was something that was implemented with like Wilt Chamberlain, and you have the flagrant fouls, which is something that happened because of the rough play of the 80s. Like you have the 5 seconds back to basket because of Charles Barkley. There's a ton of like rules and stuff that you could pinpoint what caused them, and I think that if there are other videos like that on this channel, which I will check and see, so by the time this comes out, I will have already known the answer. I think it would be a great series idea, like a series of videos to go through each sport and mark down like the 10 moments that created certain rules in this sport. Now, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I look forward to seeing you guys on a future video. I'm going to give you the deuces, and hopefully I'll see you there. Deuces.